The snow had been falling for 3 hours straight when Nathaniel Cross pulled his rented sedan into the gravel lot of a diner he never should have found. His private jet was grounded 2 counties over. His driver was stuck on black ice somewhere near the interstate. And the man, worth $11 billion, was standing alone in a parking lot in Ohio, soaked to the bone, wearing a coat that cost more than most people's cars and completely unrecognized by anyone who might have cared. The sign above the door read, "The Blue Spoon Diner," its neon buzzing weakly against the storm. Inside, it smelled like coffee and bacon grease, and something warmer than either. Something that felt like the opposite of every boardroom he had walked out of that week. He took a booth near the back, the kind with cracked vinyl seats and a napkin dispenser that had seen better decades. And he waited. Nobody came. He heard it before he saw it. A sound from the kitchen, muffled behind a swinging door. The kind of sound a person makes when they think no one is listening. A cry, choked halfway down, followed by silence, followed by another cry. Nathaniel was not a man who inserted himself into other people's business. He had learned, over 15 years of building an empire, that the fastest way to lose control of a room was to show that you cared about something in it. But something about that sound stopped him cold. He pushed through the kitchen door before he'd decided to. She was sitting on an overturned milk crate in the corner, an apron balled up in her lap, her shoulders shaking in a way that told him this wasn't the first time tonight. And it probably wasn't the first time this month either. Her name tag, still pinned crookedly to her uniform, read, Grace. She looked up at him with the kind of fear that comes from being caught rather than being found. And in that instant, as she wiped her face with the back of her hand, her sleeve rode up. That was when he saw them, rows of thin, pale lines across her forearm, some old and silvered with time, some newer, the kind of scars a person spends years learning to hide under long sleeves and forced smiles. She yanked her arm back so fast she nearly fell off the crate, and the look on her face wasn't embarrassment. It was terror. The terror of someone who has been judged before and has learned exactly what that judgment costs. "I'm fine," she said, too quickly, the words tumbling out before he'd even asked. "I'm sorry, I just needed a minute. I'll be right out. Table 4's water needs refilling. Grace." He said her name softly, like it deserved to be handled carefully. "You don't need to apologize to me." She stared at him like he'd spoken a foreign language. In her experience, people who saw those scars either recoiled or they pretended not to see, which somehow felt worse, because pretending not to see meant pretending not to care. This stranger in the expensive coat was doing neither. He crouched down, so he was eye level with her. Close enough to be present, far enough to give her room to breathe. "Long night?" he asked. She laughed, but it wasn't really a laugh. It was the sound a person makes when the alternative is screaming. "Long year," she said. And then, like she'd surprised herself by saying anything true at all, she clamped her mouth shut. Grace Whitfield was 26 years old, and she had been the one holding her family together since she was 19. Her father's auto shop had gone under 6 years earlier when the bank that financed it got swallowed by a larger bank, which got swallowed by an even larger financial group, and somewhere in that chain of acquisitions, a loan officer she never met decided her father's shop was no longer worth the risk. The shop closed. Her father's health went with it. 2 years later, her younger brother Danny got sick, the kind of sick that insurance companies love to argue about. And by the time the family won the argument, it was too late to matter. She didn't tell Nathaniel any of that in the kitchen. She wouldn't have told a stranger her middle name, let alone the truth about her arms. But grief has a way of recognizing itself, even in a room lit by nothing but a flickering fluorescent bulb, and something in the way he looked at her, not with pity, but with a kind of quiet, aching familiarity, made her wonder if he understood more than he was letting on. "You don't know me," she said, finally standing, smoothing her apron like it was armor. "You should get back to your table. I'll bring your order out." "I haven't ordered yet." "Then I'll bring you a menu." She almost smiled. Almost. He went back to his booth. She brought him coffee, black, no cream, because he asked for it that way, and because it was easier to focus on small, correct things than to think about what had just happened. For the next 20 minutes, he watched her work the floor like a woman running on fumes and willpower, refilling cups, wiping down counters, absorbing the casual rudeness of truckers who called her sweetheart and left no tip. And he found himself doing something he hadn't done in longer than he could remember. He found himself paying attention to someone who had absolutely nothing to offer him. That was when Roy Baker came out of the back office. Roy managed the Blue Spoon, the way small men manage anything they're given a little power over, which is to say, cruelly, and mostly for sport. He caught Grace near the register and didn't bother lowering his voice. "You've been in the back 20 minutes, he snapped. "We got a full house, and you're back there doing God knows what. I don't pay you to cry in my kitchen. Whitfield, I pay you to work. I'm sorry, Roy, I just needed— I don't care what you needed. You need this job? Because there's a line of girls who'd take it and not make it my problem." He glanced toward Nathaniel's booth, lowered his voice just enough to seem reasonable to anyone listening, and added, "One more slip-up, and you're done." "I mean it this time." Nathaniel didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He simply watched, memorizing the man's face. The tone, the casual cruelty dressed up as management. And he felt something settle in his chest that he recognized from a long time ago, back when he was nobody, back when people talked over him the same way. Grace apologized again, because that's what you do when you can't afford to lose a job that barely covers rent and a grandmother's blood pressure medication. And she went back to work, with her eyes down and her jaw tight, the way people do when they've trained themselves not to cry twice in one night. Nathaniel left a $100 bill under his coffee cup and walked out into the snow without saying goodbye. He should have let it go. He told himself that the entire drive back to the motel, where he was stranded for the night, he had a company with 40,000 employees, a merger closing in 9 days, a board meeting in the morning that could shift markets on 2 continents, and none of it had anything to do with a waitress in a diner in a town he'd never heard of before tonight. And yet, he lay awake until 3 in the morning, staring at a ceiling water stain shaped vaguely like Ohio, thinking about a set of scars on a stranger's arm and the particular way she'd said long year. Like the word year was doing a lot of work to cover something enormous. At 6 in the morning, he called his assistant, a woman named Priya, who had learned over the years never to ask her boss why he wanted the things he wanted, only how fast he wanted them. "I need everything on a diner called the Blue Spoon in Maple Hollow, Ohio," he said. "Ownership, financials, employee records if you can get them legally, and I need to know who owns the property it sits on." By 9 that morning, Priya had her answer, and it was the kind of answer that made Nathaniel go very still. The Blue Spoon Diner sat on land owned by a regional holding company that had 4 years earlier been quietly absorbed into a much larger portfolio, a portfolio that, 3 acquisitions up the chain, belonged to Cross Dynamics. His company. He wasn't just a customer who'd wandered in out of a snowstorm. He was, 3 degrees removed, and completely by accident, her landlord. But that wasn't what stopped his breath. It was the second name Priya pulled, almost as an afterthought. The name of the local nonprofit that had once covered a course of outpatient therapy for a 19-year-old girl named Grace Whitfield, 6 years earlier, back when her family had nothing and no way to pay for the kind of help she needed after her first hospitalization. The therapy had been funded, quietly, anonymously, through a foundation that operated with almost no public footprint. A foundation Nathaniel had started, himself, in secret, after his own sister Meredith died by suicide when he was 24 years old, and still learning how to run the company their father had left behind. He called it the Lighthouse Fund. Almost no one alive knew he was the one behind it. He had built it specifically so that his name would never be attached, because he didn't want gratitude. He wanted it to feel like help arriving from nowhere, the way he'd always wished someone had arrived for Meredith. He sat in his car outside the motel for a long time, after reading that, his hands not quite steady on the wheel. He had helped her once already, years ago, without ever knowing her name. And somehow, in a snowstorm, in the one diner in the one town he'd never planned to stop in, he had walked straight back into her life. He went back to the Blue Spoon that evening. Grace was behind the counter when the bell over the door rang, and she nearly dropped the coffee pot when she saw him walk in wearing the same coat. Though this time, there was something different in the way he carried himself, something steadier. She told herself it was none of her business what a rich stranger did with his evenings. She told herself that twice, and believed it neither time. "You're back," she said. "I left something unfinished," he said, and gestured toward the booth. "Can we talk?" "Not about the diner. About you, if you're willing." Every instinct she had told her to say no. She had spent 6 years building walls specifically designed to keep men like this. Men with money and confidence and eyes that saw too much, at a careful distance. But there had been something in the kitchen the night before. Something in the way he hadn't flinched, hadn't looked away, hadn't reached for pity, like it was the only tool he owned. And against every rule she'd made for herself, she untied her apron and sat down. He didn't lead with the diner's ownership, or the property records, or anything that might have felt like leverage. Instead, he told her about Meredith, about a sister 3 years older than him, who used to sneak him candy before dinner, and who one October morning when he was 24, didn't wake up, and about how for years afterward he searched for some sign he had missed, some warning he could have caught, if he'd only been paying attention. He told her about the Lighthouse Fund, about building it in secret because he needed his grief to become something other than useless. 6 years ago, he said carefully, watching her face the entire time, the fund covered a course of therapy for a girl in Ohio named Grace Whitfield. The color drained out of her face. "That was you!" "I didn't know your name back then. I didn't know anyone's name. That was the point." He paused. "I still don't fully understand how I ended up in your kitchen last night. But I don't think it was only bad luck with the weather." She sat with that for a long moment, turning her coffee cup slowly on the table. And when she finally spoke, her voice had lost its guard for the first time since he'd met her. "That therapy," she said quietly, "was the only reason I'm sitting here right now. I want you to know that. Not the money. The fact that someone, somewhere, decided I was worth the money." She looked up at him. "I used to wonder who that person was. I used to want to thank them. You just did." Roy Baker chose that exact moment to storm out of the back office, because cruelty, like storms, rarely waits for convenient timing. He'd apparently decided Grace's extended conversation with a customer was, once again, evidence of laziness worth broadcasting. "Whitfield, you're on the clock, not on a date. Get back to—" He stopped mid-sentence when Nathaniel stood up. "Actually," Nathaniel said, his voice calm in a way that was somehow more unsettling than shouting would have been, "I'd like to speak with you, Mr. Baker. I'm Nathaniel Cross. Cross Dynamics owns the holding company that owns this property, which means, several steps removed, it owns your lease." He let that settle. "I've been in this diner twice now. Both times, I watched you speak to your employee in a way I would never allow in any business I'm associated with. I've also spent the day reviewing labor complaints filed against this location over the past 2 years. There are 11 of them, all from women. All from this shift." Roy's face went through several colors in rapid succession, landing somewhere between chalk white and furious red. "Now, hold on. This is a misunderstanding, It isn't. Nathaniel's tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. You'll be hearing from the property management office by end of week. He didn't fire the man himself. He didn't need the theater of it. And Grace, watching the whole exchange with her mouth slightly open, understood in that moment that this wasn't about revenge, dressed up as justice. It was simpler than that. It was a man finally using the power he had to protect someone who'd never had any. Roy retreated to his office and didn't come out again that night. What happened over the following weeks unfolded slower than either of them expected, and neither of them rushed it, because both of them understood, in the particular way that only people who have survived something can understand, that healing isn't a transaction and love isn't a rescue. Nathaniel didn't sweep Grace out of her life and drop her into his. He funded, through the Lighthouse Fund, and not through his own name, a nursing scholarship she had quietly wanted for years but never believed she could afford, because she'd once told him, almost in passing, that she wanted to work in a psychiatric unit someday, wanted to be the person in the room for someone else, the way no one had fully been in the room for her. He made sure her grandmother's medical bills stopped arriving with red stamps on them. He visited the diner more than a businessman, with his schedule reasonably should have, and each time he sat in the same cracked booth. And each time the conversation went a little deeper, a little more honest, until neither of them was pretending anymore that this was only about gratitude. Grace kept working at the Blue Spoon for another 4 months, under a new manager. One who didn't flinch when he saw her roll up her sleeves on a hot day in the kitchen, because by then she'd stopped hiding them. She used to think the scars were the ugliest part of her story. Somewhere in that winter, she started to understand them differently, as proof, not of weakness, but of every single day she had chosen to stay. On the night she left for nursing school, Nathaniel drove her there himself. No assistant, no car service, just the two of them and a trunk full of everything she owned. Which wasn't much, but was hers. Somewhere on that drive, she asked him why he'd really walked into that kitchen that first night, when he could have just as easily turned around and left. Because you sounded like someone who needed one person in the world not to look away. He said, I know what that costs, when nobody does it. She didn't cry, not really, not the way she used to. She just reached over and took his hand, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, the silence between two people felt like something that didn't need to be filled. Years later, when reporters occasionally caught wind of the story, the version that circulated was simple and clean. Billionaire meets Waitress. Billionaire falls in love. Billionaire rescues Waitress from a hard life. Grace never corrected them publicly, but she knew, and Nathaniel knew, that it had never been a rescue at all. It had been two people who had both, in their own private darkness, survived something the world tried to make them ashamed of. Finding each other in a snowstorm, neither of them had planned for, and choosing, deliberately, not to look away.